see if this works. Excellent. So thank you for having me. I'm Alfred Hawkins, Assistant Curator of Historic Buildings for His Majesty's Tower of London and the Banqueting House Whitehall with Historic Royal Palaces, and Cathedral Archaeologist for Portsmouth Cathedral. So I could stand here for hours regaling you with stories about the Tower of London, but today I'm going to limit myself to life, death and worship at the Tower of London, or more specifically, a history of the Chapel Royal of St. Peter at Vincula. So I should say now, this is not going to be an exhaustive history of either the tower or the chapel, but I'll be happy to answer questions about either at the end. So starting with a little bit of background, I work for Historic Royal Palaces, which is the charity that cares for 6 royal palaces: the Tower of London, Hampton Court Palace, the Banqueting House Whitehall, Kew Palace, including Queen Charlotte's Cottage and the Pagoda, Kensington Palace and Hillsborough Castle and Gardens in Northern Ireland. We care for the conservation and interpretation of these palaces without any external funding, and so if you do want to support our work, please consider donating. So enough of the plugs. So what does a building curator actually do? My role is to advise on the history, archaeology and built fabric of the Tower of London and the Banqueting House Whitehall, and to share their stories both on-site and further afield. These palaces span almost 2,000 years of history, and so to look after them, our curatorial department holds a wide variety of specialisms, including architectural historians, below and above ground archaeologists, historic paint experts, researchers, historians, collection specialists, conservators, and anything in between. Personally, I fall somewhere in the half architectural historian, half buildings archaeologist area. Most of my time in this role is acting as one of the principal advocates for the history of the site on capital development, conservation, and day-to-day maintenance projects. So working as an advocate for the history, archaeology, fabric, stories, myths of these buildings. But this all centres around research, recording, and understanding more about the historic site in order to share it and draw in visitors to create the revenue that it takes to look after these places. So for those of you who've been living under a rock for 945 years, this is the wonderful and slightly maddening and slightly bonkers collection of buildings that make up the Tower of London. The tower is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a scheduled ancient monument, and it contains numerous individually listed buildings. The White Tower, William the Conqueror's keep, sits at the heart of the fortress and is the main and most predominant feature of the site, being the most complete surviving example of Norman royal architecture in the United Kingdom. However, almost 1,000 years of history and development surround it. The site has been a palace, a fortress, a record office, a place of execution, headquarters for the Board of Ordnance, and innumerable things in between, alongside being the home of thousands of craftspeople, officers, residents, and their families. It also held numerous pubs and one medieval polar bear, some of which I will manage to talk about today. Beyond its designations, the tower is an integral part of our national memory, with many of its stories forming the core of numerous popular historic narratives, some of which I'm sure you know. But for most people, these consist of the exciting myths of torture, treason, yeomen, birds, and princes, which I will not be talking about today. And if that is your view of the tower, then you are not wrong. It has been the site of some of the darkest moments of our history, whether on a massive scale through the 1290 expulsion of the Jews, or tragedies on an individual level through persecution, imprisonment, and execution. All too often, however, these stories create the perception of a terrifying monolith filled with scandal, execution, and horrifying incidents that colour the perception of the entire fortress. However, these dramatic events are much more akin to the punctuation of the story of the fortress, with much of its day-to-day life focused around administration and the lives of individual people living and working at the tower. And on this note, we come to the tower's chapels, of which there are 2 surviving, although there would be many smaller oratories and chapels which would have been located throughout the palatial buildings during the tower's history. Principal chapel forms part of the White Tower, the spectacular 11th century chapel of St. John the Evangelist. It is one of the most beautiful spaces in the fortress and is the last surviving example of Royal Anglo-Norman ecclesiastic architecture in the UK, built as a private chapel for William the Conqueror from 1078. Although it's one of the most important architectural spaces, described as the most important part of the most important part of the fortress, much of its history is non-secular, as the White Tower wasn't used as a royal residence for that long, and most of its history from around the 13th century onwards is as a record office and a store, though it appears to have been periodically used ceremonially. The second of these chapels, and our focus today, is the 16th century chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, or St. Peter in Chains. St. Peter's is found within the inner ward to the northwest of the White Tower, and is a building of exceptional importance, having borne witness to events of national and international significance, and almost all of the macabre stories of the tower's history have touched the chapel in some way. The building is principally known for being a mausoleum for numerous individuals whose stories I won't be able to tell tonight, but the most well-known of these are two saints of the Catholic Church and three queens of England, St. Thomas Fisher, St. John Fisher, Thomas More, Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, and Lady Jane Grey. But what else makes this building so important? It is obviously part of the UNESCO World Heritage Site and Scheduled Monument. It is a Grade 1 listed building, and an internationally important visitor attraction, being one of the most important places of modern Tudor pilgrimage. It is the home of exceptional music through a branch of the Chapel Royal Choir, a historic place of burial, and one of 6 Chapel Royals and 8 Royal Peculiars in England. This last designation is the most important, placing it outside of the jurisdiction of the diocese and under the authority of His Majesty's King Charles III as visitor. It, however, does not mean that the chapel is beyond the realms of statutory law, which will become important later on. St. Peter's most important role, though, is as a working chapel, historically serving the tower's community of yeoman warders, its garrison, craftsmen, Board of Ordnance staff, and their families. This is a service it continues to provide today, hosting regular services, concerts, baptisms, and weddings. And this continued use provides the chapel with a lived evolution that's been somewhat removed from the other buildings on site. And this is a picture of my friend and colleague, Kat, being married, which she kindly lent me for the purposes of today. To properly understand the development of this building, we need to go back to its roots. Placement of the chapel within the Tower of London often results in the perception that the history of the building is entirely tied to the development of the fortress. And while this is true of its later history, the origins of the chapel are likely to predate the fortress and could relate to a pre-conquest chapel. Evidence of pre-conquest occupation of London is exceptionally rare at the site, so rare that it's been suggested that the entire site was actually cleared prior to the construction of the White Tower. Though if this is true, it must have been exceptionally thorough, because I think we've only found about 6 bits of pottery in the entire archaeological record of the site. So with a complete absence of physical or artifactual remains, the evidence for this pre-conquest chapel is largely based around the inferred presence of a gate at the terminus of Great Tower Street and the Eastern London Wall, the remnants of Roman Londinium. So there is no conclusive evidence for this gate, but there is some circumstantial evidence from later litigation and modern archaeological evidence. The documentary evidence for this chapel is found in the 12th century through extensive litigation between the Chapel of St. Peter and nearby St. Boltoff's Church, Aldgate, concerning rights over the extramural area of East Smithfield, which is to the east of the eastern landward wall. And this suggests that the area may have once formed part of the parochial territory of the chapel, and it would stand to reason that if it is part of the chapel's parish, then it was probably accessible from the chapel through some form of gate in the wall. This notion of access is supported by the excavation of a medieval postern gate to the north of the tower in 1979. This gate, although built in the 13th century, following the construction of Edward I's moat, implies established access into the city and had previously existed in this area prior to the intrusion of the tower in that area. Additionally, a petrological and historic assessment of the Wardrobe Tower to the southeast of the White Tower in 2016 identified significant evidence for the presence of a Roman bastion in that location, which could have formed part of or an extension to a gate in that location given its position along the line of Great Tower Street. Given that the only intrusion in this area, albeit a rather robust one, is the tower itself, it would stand to reason that if this gate existed, it existed prior to 1067, subsequently placing the origins of the chapel to around the 9th century with a potential for earlier phases. Following the conquest in 1066, the development of the chapel can be seen to move more in relation to that of the tower. The history of the fortress is understandably quite complicated, but we are going to fly through the 5 most important periods from 1066. First is the original siting of the fortress within the southeastern corner of the Roman city walls. This is thought initially to have taken the form of a ringwork fortification by 1067, with the construction of the White Tower occurring between 1078 and 1100. The evidence for this enclosure is largely formed of earthworks which were excavated to the north of the White Tower in 1967 and to the west of the main guard wall between 1972 and 75. And at this point, if there is a chapel, it is located outside of the enclosure and appears to have no relationship with the fortress. Subsequently, in 1110, it is thought that Henry I either rebuilt or significantly altered the chapel. The reason behind the reconstruction of the building is not fully understood, as the chapel would have remained outside of the walled enclosure during this period. However, it is described between 1128 and 1157 as within the bailey or bailiwick of the fortress, which may have taken the form of an outer ward or outer bailey, probably with some sort of earthworks and a palisade, although any evidence for such early defences have certainly been destroyed by the subsequent expansion of the fortress and development of buildings in the surrounding area. So all we have really is our best guess, which is largely focused on the position of what would become the Tower Liberties, which was an area under the jurisdiction of the king and not of the City of London. The next significant series of works in relation to the tower is the Angevin expansion of the fortress to the west during the reigns of Richard and John between 1189 and 1216. This increased the area of the fortress to the extent of the surviving bell tower, with a gatehouse in the approximate position of the Beauchamp Tower. This would have enabled access along Great Tower Street, from which a curtain wall returned to the Roman eastern landward wall, and again the chapel is left outside of these expansions. The largest scheme of works, though, were undertaken during the reigns of the Plantagenet kings, of which 2 phases are particularly important, those of Henry III and Edward I. Henry III expanded the tower both northward and eastwards, beyond the limits of the original landward defences between the 1220s and 1260s, forming what is largely the current inner curtain wall. Henry III also undertook significant works within the chapel in 1240, the accounts of which enabled the first assessment of its decoration and organisation. These works included the replacement of the roof, installation of new windows, repairs, decorative painting, whitewashing, and the installation of large and beautiful stalls for Henry III and Eleanor of Provence. The layout of the church is also described, showing that it held 2 chancels, one for St. Mary and another for St. Peter, alongside altars to St. Catherine and St. Nicholas. Crucially, these works display that the chapel is being used by a reigning monarch, and so this is the first evidence we have for what is probably a parish church or a garrison church, albeit with an association with the royal fortress, becoming a royal chapel, likely operating as a free royal chapel in a similar way to St. George's. Following this, during the reign of Edward I, the tower was expanded in all directions with the construction of the outer ward, itself ringed by the current outer curtain wall, and the moat, which largely forms the general dimensions of the tower as we know it today. In 1286-87, what is likely to be the 12th century chapel, was demolished and rebuilt with the accounts of Ralph of Sandwich, then Constable of the Tower, including £317, 8 shillings and 3 pence for the construction of a great new chapel, though no documents survive showing its location, decoration, or layout, much to my displeasure. Although extensive works are undertaken throughout the following centuries, little is documented in terms of the chapel until it is destroyed by fire in 1512. So following this fire, the tower would have been and its community of soldiers, administrators, craftspeople were without a place of worship, as the tower's other chapel, St. John the Evangelist, had been since at least 1320 appropriated as an archive by the Exchequer Record Office. Subsequently, the King's Book of Payments in 1519 and 1520 note the payment of £260 to Walter and Thomas Forster, both controllers of the King's works, for the building of a parish church within the Tower of London, under the supervision of Sir Richard Cholmondeley, who was then Lieutenant of the Tower, creating largely the building as it now stands. The building of this parish church should not really be taken in terms of jurisdiction, but rather in terms of the parish of the Tower Liberties, which, as I've mentioned, were under the jurisdiction of the King and not under the jurisdiction of the Bishops of London. The next scheme of works, which are directly applicable to the chapel, was the presumed blocking of the original western entrance and the construction of an Elizabethan porch on the southern elevation in 1559. And this leaves us with the building that is first documented in this plan, which is the 1597 Hayward and Gascoigne true and exact plan of the tower from 1597, which is the first reliable visual source for the tower. But this plan doesn't just show us where the Tudor chapel is, but can also be used to infer where Edward's chapel was. To the north and east, the area is dominated by storehouses, themselves constructed prior to the chapel, and to the south, a main guard building, which was also constructed prior to 1520. And so this helps us to, this gives us the rough dimensions of where Edward's chapel could have been, which is likely in roughly the same area as the current building. And it also helps us to locate the extramural burial ground of the chapel throughout this period. The main body of the building forms a nave leading to the chancel, where the memorial pavement commemorating royal interments is located, and to the north, separated by primary Reigate arches, is a nave aisle which houses the organ, which dates from 1699, and provides access into the vestry and crypt. The former was built in the 19th century, and the latter is a bastardized version of a basement of a Board of Ordnance storehouse, which has been repurposed in order to make it into a crypt. The basement is the sole surviving remnant of the ordnance storehouses from the early 16th century, and those are the storehouses which we think can be seen on the Hayward and Gascoigne plan in 1597. The chapel is lit by tracery windows, most of which are Tudor in style, though it appears as though a number of them, if not all of them, have been replaced. And some other interesting architectural features give us an insight into the early Tudor history of the building and its pre-Reformation construction. In the eastern elevation of the nave aisle, there's a piscina and hagioscope or squint, the former a stone basin and the latter an opening in the wall that allows the main altar to be visible from the northern nave aisle. And these are distinctive of Catholic or pre-Reformation churches and tell us that a smaller altar was probably once in this location, possibly a lady chapel or something of that ilk. One of the most spectacular Tudor features, though, is the exposed timber ceiling. So there's a popular myth that the roof was built using Spanish chestnut so that Catherine of Aragon could pray beneath the trees of her homeland. And this is it paints an enticing picture because Henry VIII is known to have used architecture to show his affections. The cupolas on the White Tower, added for the coronation of Anne Boleyn in the 1530s, are a fantastic example of that. However, there is no documentary evidence for why chestnut was chosen, or if indeed it came from Spain. So regardless of its mythical origins, it is still one of the most important architectural survivals of the building. And it's during this period in which much of the popular history of the building was formed. Numerous Tudor, and indeed later, executions solidified the building's position within our national memory. As I've mentioned, interments include Thomas More, Henry VIII's Lord Chancellor, John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, who were both executed in 1535 after being held in the Bell Tower. Other individuals, including 3 queens and many subjects of persecution and torture and imprisonment, who we now remember for their faith, integrity, and intelligence, are also interred in the chapel. The popular history of these individuals is incredibly important to the 16th century and beyond. But as I've said, it creates this perception that the building is solely tied to the great and the good. And while they are incredibly important, these histories are not normality. To that end, we come to arguably one of the chapel's most important functions, to care for the spiritual needs of the Tower community, which it was doing throughout this period. In this regard, St. Peter's holds a truly exceptional survival. Its register of burials, baptisms, and marriages dating from 1550, 1580, and 1587, respectively, until 1821. While some executed individuals are included, such as Thomas Arundel, these records, which are compiled from numerous different sources and are by no means complete, paint an entirely different perception of the chapel's history. Through these records, the idea of a mausoleum for the great and good is wholly replaced by a representation of the community the chapel cared for. Burials, baptisms, and marriages of administrators, craftspeople, soldiers, and residents outnumber prisoners in the order of thousands, showing the chapel not as a place of misery, but as a representation of English religious life in microcosm, and above all, as a place of faith. Notably, later entries include the baptism of individuals of African and Asian descent, including Charles Kennington, John Swan, and Francis Chasey. Both John and Francis are described as black servants, and though much of the detail of these individuals' histories are lost to us, including whether or not they were enslaved, though that seems incredibly probable, these entries allow us to paint a more accurate picture of the Tower community as a whole, showing us that the community the chapel served was as diverse as other neighbourhoods within London. And it's this that always leaves me more fascinated with the history of the chapel. It's not the history of the kings and queens, but the history of the individual people who are living, working, worshipping, and dying at the fortress. The Tower declined as a royal residence from the 1530s as other more fashionable palaces were built, rivaling those of the continent. And as a result, the Tower was altered on an ever-increasing scale, becoming largely unrecognisable by the time of the Civil War. The history of the fortress during the years of the interregnum is difficult to trace, with much of the administration of England being lost to Presbyterian limbo. However, following the Restoration, it was essential that Charles II regain control of the Tower. It's important to remember that despite the decline in the use of the Tower as a royal residence, it remained, as it still does, an important representation of control or lack thereof. The loss of the fortress in 1642 was catastrophic not solely as a garrison, mint, or storehouse, but as this perceived lack of control. And so in 1660, the Tower once again became the depository of the crown jewels, although the regalia at that point only consisted of 3 swords and the coronation spoon. The appointment of Sir Gilbert Tabolt as master of the jewel house was, rather than an act of governance, a clear reassertion of Charles II's authority over the fortress. This, however, did not signal a resurgence in the Tower's royal use, but instead an expansion of its role as the administrative heart of England. You can see this dramatic change in this plan from 1681, which shows sprawling storehouses, offices, and previous royal buildings being altered for more practical uses. And this increase in the use of the Tower by the Board of Ordnance is shown later in that decade through the construction of the Grand Storehouse, the largest building ever to exist within the complex, in 1688, replacing the Tudor storehouses to the north and east of the chapel. And it is that massive building just to the north of the White Tower that you can see on this picture. And this expansion of administrative life would have far-reaching consequences for the chapel. By 1755, the expansion of the Tower's garrison led to the installation of a gallery projecting from the northern and western walls, distorting any appreciation of the internal masonry arches. This is important as, despite its catastrophic architectural impact, this gallery is symptomatic of the use of the chapel. There is no evidence here for the intimate chapel royal built by Henry VIII. These alterations are made with the single purpose of fitting more and more people into the chapel as a garrison church. However, the increase in administrative life at the tower was not all bad, as it led to a dramatic increase in the quantity of records that were made. And as we move into the 19th century, we're presented with the first evidence that allows us to mark the specific location of the chapel's extramural burial ground in any detail. This plan from 1824 shows areas of consecrated ground within the tower, showing the northernmost section of Tower Green and a considerable portion of the parade ground located to the north of the White Tower as consecrated ground. There was an additional area to the east showing proposed addition to the burial ground, but it's unknown if this was ever implemented. The use of the chapel as a garrison chapel remained largely unchanged, and following these alterations, the next significant event in the building's history occurred in 1841, when a catastrophic fire tore through the grand storehouse, and which, due to its proximity to the chapel, caused some significant damage. So plans drawn immediately following the event show how close the chapel actually was to the grand storehouse and how lucky we are that it survived this blaze. Notes on this plan show that some of the lead roofing and presumably a number of the timbers in the roof were damaged following the blaze and were replaced in order to maintain the building's structural integrity. Following this, in 1842, we get the first reliable interior plan of the chapel. The pink areas, which are, they are pink up there, which is good, show spaces used by the clergy and the location of the pulpit against the southern wall, which would allow the preacher to be clearly seen by the entire congregation. So this is an interesting choice in quite a small chapel, which was presumably done as a result of the gallery being constructed from which the main altar would not have been visible. And again, this is symptomatic of the chapel's use as a parish church for the garrison of the tower, not as a chapel royal. The wholesale destruction of the storehouse, though, was to have further-reaching impacts on the chapel itself, as it was now required that a new garrison and store be built within the tower. This resulted in the construction of the Waterloo Block in 1844, which is the home of the Crown Jewels and my office today, under the direction of the Duke of Wellington, who was then Constable of the Tower. The block was placed immediately to the east of the chapel and resulted in a significant portion of the consecrated ground identifiable in 1824 to be destroyed, as you can see in this plan. And for those of you who haven't been, this image gives you some idea of the catastrophic impact of that building on the scale of the chapel, which you can see in the background, and is representative of the light-handed 19th century approach to building at the tower. The next significant period in the chapel's history follows the construction of Waterloo Block and coincides with the re-medievalization of the fortress in the latter half of the 19th century by Anthony Salvin and John Taylor, during which a lot of medieval fabric was destroyed to somehow make the tower look more medieval. So in relation to the chapel, the first alteration in 1862 was the removal of the insignificant Elizabethan porch, which had allowed easy access into the chapel for some 200 or 300 years. And you can see that porch in this image, and instead what was thought to be the original open in the western elevation reopened, which is the method currently used to access the chapel. Following this, from 1876 to 77, a much larger scheme of work was undertaken internally by John Taylor. These works focused on the removal of the dark wood and 18th century pews, which, whilst typical of a garrison church, did not represent the importance or aesthetics of the chapel. Importantly, in this photo, you can see the horrifying gallery as well, which is awful. So the removal of the seating and the gallery, which would have refocused worshippers' attention towards the main altar, rather than the dominating Georgian pulpit that stood in the middle of the south wall. And further alterations were undertaken during this period, including the removal of a lath and plaster ceiling, which enabled the Tudor chestnut roof to be visible much as it is today. And the results of this work can be seen in the photograph taken between 1877 and 1881, before the installation of the Whitehall organ in 1891. A smaller pulpit is installed near the chancel, and high box pews were replaced with oak bench pews, which were reduced in size and reorientated to face the east. The large wooden altar screen was removed and replaced with a stone neo-Gothic example, and the most beneficial part of this work was the removal of the gallery, allowing the Tudor Reigate arches to once again be appreciated as was originally intended. One of the most significant aspects of this work, though, was the restabilisation of the floor within the chapel, which had begun to move owing due to large quantity of internments within the chapel proper. During this work, the entire interior of the chapel was excavated, identifying, and I say identifying with very, very large brackets, where they could, and the removal of many individuals for reinterment within the crypt. The total number of individuals removed to the crypt is not known, and nor is there any discussion of stratigraphy or detailed recording throughout this entire process. But if the registers are to be believed, then it wouldn't be surprising if some thousands of individuals, either in articulated or disarticulated form, were excavated from within the chapel. And this plan shows the position of identifiable coffins, which are really the only ones that we can rely on, and whether or not they're removed to the crypt or remain in situ. These documents, which were created during the same scheme of works, show the position in which the most notable remains were buried within the chapel. The right-hand document shows the relative position of significant remains of Queen Anne Boleyn, Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, Lady Rochford, Edward, the Duke of Somerset, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, and James, Duke of Monmouth. That being said, no scientific methods were used to test the identity of these individuals because they didn't exist at that point in time. And subsequently, it cannot be stated with any certainty where the remains of any one individual is buried within the crypt or the chapel proper. And this is important to remember as we get onto the notes from the 9th of November 1876, which document the discovery of the skeletal remains of Queen Anne Boleyn. And I appreciate that you probably won't be able to read this, so it says, "The pavement was then lifted on the spot which is marked thus on plan number 1, and the earth removed to a depth of 2 feet. It had certainly not been disturbed for upwards of 100 years. At this depth, the bones of a female were found not lying in their original order, but which had been evidently, for some reason or other, heaped together into a smaller space. All the bones were examined by Dr. Moat, who at once pronounced them to be those of a female between 25 and 35 years of age, of a delicate frame of body, and who had certainly been of slender and perfect proportions. The forehead and lower jaw were especially small and well formed. The vertebrae were particularly small, especially one joint, which was that next to the skull, and they bore witness to the Queen's little neck." He thought that these female bones had lain in the earth for some 300 years and were certainly all those of one person, and no other female bones were found lying on this spot. So, where to begin? We all know the power of a good myth, and no one really beats the Victorians in that regard, but there are quite a few large problems here. So, as I've mentioned, during the excavation, there is no discussion of stratigraphy, though there are clearly areas of disturbance. Additionally, we know that in 1876, the tools that we take for granted, such as osteoarchaeology, DNA, radiocarbon and isotope testing, did not exist. And instead, most bones were assessed via phrenology, which is largely unreliable and is often used in incredibly racist ways. Because of this, there is no assessment of the pathology of the bones and the quite devastating damage that you would expect to see when a sword goes through somebody's neck. So stating at once the nature of these bones as either male or female, their age, and that they bear witness to particular features of a queen for which there are no portraits, suggests to me that this work was done with a foregone conclusion in mind, finding the skeleton of the lost queen. Some things do point in the right direction. The bones were found in the chancel, the holiest part of the chapel, which would be fitting for a Queen of England, even one who had been executed. And there were apparently no other female bones in this location, though, as I've mentioned, the identification of all of the bones outside of those with coffin plates is problematic. So in reality, there is no proof of anyone being buried anywhere in the chapel, and personally, I think it's quite unlikely that those are the bones of Anne Boleyn. However, the Victorians did not care what I would think, and instead installed the memorial pavement to royal internments anyway. And obviously, this pavement misses out the usurper, Lady Jane Grey, who obviously was not a real queen in the eyes of the Victorians. And this now serves as one of the most important sites of modern Tudor pilgrimage in England. I should say at this point, after I've just burst the bubble of Anne Boleyn, that I have an interesting relationship with myths working at the Tower. There is no evidence that Anne is under that slab. However, there is very little evidence for most of the myths at the Tower, and all of them colour the perception of the fortress. So in my line of work, truth is frequently a mutable idea, and the myths are not necessarily something I would change or get rid of. Not only do they have their own cultural heritage as stories which have been told for almost 200 years, but they also provide an essential means to engage with the history of the Tower and its amazing stories. And that's what being a buildings curator is all about, taking those ideas and building on them and sharing information in any way we can. And that does not include destroying the lived history of different spaces. So following these extensive works, the floor in the chapel was relaid, and these images from 1936 act as a good representation of the nave and chancel, showing the creation of a much more intimate space suited to the chapel's role as then a perceived chapel royal. Historic photography following this is somewhat lacking, and it's not until 1971, following another large scheme of works, which focused on the removal of most of the Victorian elements of the chapel, that a good view of the interior as a whole can be found. One of the most prominent features of this image is the organ, which was installed in 1891. And while the organ is altogether too large for the space, it is a historically significant instrument in its own right, being built in 1699 by Bernhard Schmidt, better known as Father Smith, for the banqueting house Whitehall, which, following the Whitehall Palace fire, had been used as a chapel royal and a garrison church. And also visible in this picture under the first arch is the outstanding alabaster tomb of Sir Richard Cholmondeley, the individual who oversaw the construction of the chapel. So following this, as the chapel moved into the 21st century, yet another full refurbishment was undertaken in 2014, during which the furniture of the chapel was entirely replaced and much of the historic fabric was conserved. The chapel in this form was opened by Queen Elizabeth II and brings us up to the present day in terms of the building's chronology. So now you're up to date with the history of the building, and a few of you are not asleep. So I will now start talking about some of the recent excavations that we've carried out and how this enables us to learn more about the building and its development. So firstly, it's important to understand that to note that the days of Victorian intervention are long gone. Following the establishment of historic royal palaces in 1998, conservation and archaeological methodologies applied to the palaces has been irrevocably changed. Research excavations are no longer undertaken, and where intervention must be made, it is on an exceptionally small scale in order to preserve the stratigraphy and the archaeological potential of the site. Everything we do in terms of interventive work is based on these principles, and we are overseen by the Venerable Jane Siddell, who is sat at the back of the room. But one area where excavation is almost always required is in relation to issues of access. So as you can see from this image, the chapel is only accessible down a flight of stairs. There are other entrances, all of which consist of either one set of stairs or multiple sets of stairs, and those other entrances take you into the crypt, not the chapel proper, which can only be accessed via a set of stairs. So the tower is understandably hard to walk around. It is a fortress after all, but where we can, historic royal palaces are determined to share our buildings with anybody and everybody. This presents an obvious issue. How do you provide or facilitate dignified access into one of the most nationally and internationally important monuments and part of the Tower of London. The answer to that, through a fairly extensive design phase, was the expansion of the stairwell to the west and the installation of a retractable stair lift. But before we attempted to install this, though, we needed to understand the archaeological potential of the area, for which I ended up doing a massive period of research. One of the most interesting parts of this exercise was mapping focused around the 1824 plan that I showed you earlier. Given the history of the site and its potential use since the 9th century, it's likely that the boundaries of the extramural burial ground attached to the chapel had changed. And to this end, I mapped every location where either disarticulated or in situ human remains had been encountered within the fortress during modern archaeological excavations, crucially excluding one Iron Age burial. And so from that, it's clear that the burial ground identified in 1824 is not representative of the entire burial ground associated with the chapel. And this is supported by historic accounts from the tower from as early as 1597, saying that there is not within the tower any place sufficient for their burials. And similarly, in 1934, when it is stated that Tower Green is a graveyard. Any flat stone you tread on is a gravestone, and if you look closely, you will often see a bee cut on such a stone. The bees rely on a custom carried out by a former Office of Works superintendent who instructed his workmen, if you are working on the green and find bones, don't attract any attention. Throw a little dirt on them, scratch a bee on the stone, and walk away. So clearly complying with best practice there. But with the identification of the area as somewhere with a reasonable chance of discovering human remains, we had to comply with the Burial Act to cover the potential for removing them. And there is no evidence of deconsecration, so a ministry license was out of the question. This took the most time in terms of the project as a whole, because the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula is a chapel royal and royal peculiar, and it is therefore exempt from the Diocese hierarchy. But as I said earlier, it's not exempt from statutory law, and so while the Burial Act applied to the building, there was actually nobody who could fulfil its requirements to grant permission outside of the monarch or the Privy Council, and we didn't really want to bother them without knowing exactly where the boundaries of that jurisdiction fell, because it would have far-reaching consequences for the governance of the site. This took over a year of research, with me nattering on to many of my colleagues, much to their disdain, and to cut an 11,000-word guidance document and an article in the Ecclesiastic Law Journal into a few sentences. This research showed that the chapel was stripped of its status as a royal peculiar in 1550 and 1485, officially coming into the care of the Diocese of London. Not that this really mattered to the chapel, who continued to operate on a potent mixture of assumed medieval privilege and contempt for episcopal authority until it was finally reinstated as a chapel royal in 1965, but crucially without any mention of the burial ground. And that meant that legally, the burial ground and the chapel could be treated as two separate entities, with the chapel itself forming the royal peculiar with the curtilage of the outer wall, while the burial ground itself was under the care of the Diocese of London. And this allowed the project manager for the overall project to apply for a faculty from the diocese. And as I've said, this presents a number of complications for the governance of the site as a whole and the governance of royal peculiars as a whole, because they represent some of the finest architectural survivals in the country, and a number of them don't have fabric advisory committees or similar, and so there are other sites that have similar jurisdictional issues. So at this point, we had scheduled monument clearance, not consent, because we have a fancy agreement with Historic England, and a faculty for the possibility of encountering human remains from the Diocese of London, and we were able to undertake the trial excavation, which would inform us on the scale of archaeological work that will be required for the major project. Unfortunately, the major project to actually install the lift has been delayed by the COVID-19 pandemic, during which historic royal palaces lost £110 million. Plug, 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 please donate. But it should be happening next year. So the first pit to be opened within the stairwell was within the stairwell of the chapel, and within 5 centimetres we were able to tell that this area was largely undisturbed by modern works due to the presence of a mortar floor surface related to an outbuilding constructed between 1681 and 1737, which had been identified during the research phase, predominantly used as a coal store. So I've included the plans here to show you roughly where it is. There are 2 areas of disturbance through it, one of which is a 19th century culvert and the other is a 20th century electrical main, so not particularly interesting. Beneath this surface was a layer of redeposited backfill which contained Roman jet fragments, glazed medieval tile shards, and some of which appear to be decorative, and pottery largely dating from the 16th century. And this fill surmounted a significant mortar floor surface, which is 22 centimetres thick and partially covered by a thin layer of ash. Clearly a bedding surface for a floor of some quality, as shown by the extent of the surface spreading beyond the excavation in all directions. This deposit was the most significant identified of those during the excavations. The surface is located outside and 0.5 metres below the 1519 to 1520 construction, and with no evidence for the construction of a narthex or related chantry in this location, although it can't be ruled out, it appears as though this deposit may relate to the construction of a previous high-status building on the site. So to begin to identify what this building might be, we have to go back to the plan of the tower from 1597, which, as I've said, is the earliest reliable visual source of the fortress. And this is key, as although it dates from 1597, as I've said, we can use it to infer the position of buildings that are not included within it. To the north and east, the area is dominated by storehouses and the main guard building to the south, all of which constructed prior to the period between 1512 and 1520, when Edward I's chapel burns down and Henry VIII's chapel is built. So although we have, and because we have no evidence for any other buildings being constructed in that location, it appears as though that surface may be related to the construction of Edward I's chapel, or probably a later expansion of it through a chantry or outbuilding or something similar. There are, however, problems with this, as they are with everything and every time we stick a spade in the ground at the tower. The level of ash deposition over the top of the surface is not representative of a fire during which a substantial building was lost, but this may be explained by the clearance of the previous building. And this is where an assessment of the built archaeology of the current structure comes into play. The building shown on the 1597 plan is by and large the building as we know it today, and is an interesting example of early Tudor ecclesiastic architecture. However, it holds a number of secrets which you can only observe by peeling the Victorian editions off. So this occurred between 1999 and 2001 when Robin Sanderson and Jeremy Ashby undertook a petrological assessment of the bell tower and western elevations, and found that the walls had actually been built out of a large quantity of recycled material, some of which showed signs of burning, which was probably taken from the remnants of Edward I's chapel. Additionally, on the western elevation above the door, there is a window which was discovered in 1862 when that entrance was opened in decorative rather than perpendicular style, which was probably a reused medieval feature and not one dating to the Tudor period, although in typical fashion this was replaced with a copy in 1862, and so that is the current window that we have left. But given that that work was undertaken by Anthony Salvin and not John Taylor, we can be fairly sure that it is a good representation of what was there beforehand. So each of these features show us that the old building, built by Edward I, was probably cleared, and reusable material was cobbled into the 1520 construction that we now know. And this lends some support to the idea that this mortar surface is related to a previous high-status building, but that's the exciting thing, is we don't know, and at some point during the major project, that will be one of the main research aims, to actually try and identify that surface properly and solidify its assessment. Through the surface were cut 3 burials, consisting of 2 complete skeletons and 1 partial skeleton, and charnel associated with approximately 5 individuals, which were excavated during the same period. The lowest of these burials, dated by pottery in the fill to the late medieval period, almost certainly predates the construction of the current chapel, with 2 subsequent interments likely dating from the 16th century, again dated through pottery. So due to the truncation of the intermingling interments through the surface, we could not tell whether or not the initial burial located at the bottom of the pit was cut through that surface or the surface overlaid it, which would have helped with dating it, but there we are. These individuals, consisting of an adult female, between the 2 complete skeletons rather, consisted of an adult female between 35 and 45 years old, and a 13 to 16-year-old, whose sex could not be identified, are currently being subject to radiocarbon and isotopic analysis at the University of Cardiff, which has kindly been funded by the London and Middlesex Archaeological Society through their research grant. So we will have more information about them in the future, but through the initial assessments, we can understand a little bit about them. So neither had any burial goods, and so the assessment was predominantly focused on the bones themselves. The child, which was the higher of the 2 burials, was found without any coffin nails, and a corrosive mark on the forehead, which was likely to be the corrosion of a pin, which leads us to believe that the child was shrouded prior to burial. This is supported by the position of the skull, which is not lolled to one side and is instead leaning towards the feet, and the position of the arms crossed over the abdomen, which suggested this individual was buffeted on all sides by earth at the time of burial. As I'm sure all of you know, this kind of burial doesn't particularly denote any kind of class standing, but the bones did show some signs of stunted growth from malnutrition, which suggests either a relatively low status life or possibly a period of sickness during which the child didn't eat that much. But again, through the work done by the University of Cardiff, we're hoping to get a little bit more of an understanding of that. The 35 to 45-year-old woman was found surrounded by coffin nails, suggesting that she had been buried in a coffin. And this is supported by the position of the bones themselves, with the head lolled to one side towards the south, and the position of the hands on either side of the body not crossed over. And this skeleton showed potentially the sign of a chronic back condition, suggesting a relatively hard life, but not significantly malnourished. So again, while this individual was buried in a coffin, there is not really much we can say about their status at this point. So it's not a huge amount of information, I understand, but I'm no osteoarchaeologist. But what makes these individuals so important is that they are not the princes, they are not Anne Boleyn, they are not Catherine Howard. They are almost certainly people who lived, worked, and died at the fortress. And through the work of Cardiff University, we hopefully we'll be able to understand more of the normal residential life at the tower. And it's incredibly rare to glimpse these lives on such an intimate level within the fortress. So hopefully this will create a framework for future analysis as well. So while there are lots of questions left about the development of the chapel and previous buildings that occupy the site, and indeed the individuals who lived within those buildings, we are always trying to share what we're doing as quickly as we can, and enhancing our understanding and the understanding of our visitors. And this is another key part of being a buildings curator, to use this kind of research to share stories. And this has been achieved in this instance through the creation of a number of blogs, publications, media print appearances, and new interpretation panels for the chapel. So while the project is still pending, the information has definitely not gone to waste. And so to conclude, I'd like to go back to the chapel's roles as a place of faith, music, comfort, peace, and happiness, alongside being the backdrop for some of the darkest moments in our history, and explain why it's my favourite building at the tower. I hope I've shown you that the chapel's history is much more than the myths which surround it, but just how integral those myths are to its continued evolution and lived experience. And I also hope I've shown you how much work is done in order to move the understanding of the site and the tower as a whole forward, sharing new stories with our visitors wherever we can. But more than that, I hope I've been able to share a glimpse of the incredible span of the chapel's life, and how its fabric can tell us not only about the current building, but previous buildings that have occupied the site and the people who worshipped within it. And for me, is what makes the chapel really special, is probably, since the 9th century, the chapel has been a chapel. Every other building at the tower has been a prison, a residence, a office, a storehouse, a palace, anything you could possibly throw at it. But the chapel has only ever had that one use, and so its continued use and the stories that come out of it just have that essence of lived experience that you don't get in various other buildings. So well done, and thank you. And if you've got any questions, I will happily try and answer them.